To the point. Creating evidence-based pastoral succession documents. Hello, my name is Russ Crabtree. I'll be your presenter. I'm an author of several books, including books on pastoral succession processes. I'm a trainer, and I'm a consultant that's worked with literally hundreds of churches in pastoral transitions. This is the first of several lessons on how to develop pastoral succession documents. At the end of this first lesson, learners will be able to describe the difference between a pastoral succession plan and a pastoral succession management process. You'll also be able to name and define 3 key pastoral succession documents that you will need to develop. Articulate the importance of all 3 documents, distinguish an evidence-based process from other approaches you might consider, and finally, to understand the meaning of site-specific. There are 2 different succession processes. First, there's what we call a pastoral succession planning process. In a pastoral succession plan, the search process actually begins before the pastor leaves. Because the pastor remains on site during the search process, no interim pastor is required, or there may be a short-term interim pastor between the departure of the pastor and the arrival of the next pastor. A pastoral succession planning approach is frequently used at the retirement of a pastor. A pastoral succession management process is different, and it's what churches usually experience. Here, the search process begins after the pastor leaves. There's often a long-term interim pastor that is called for 1 to 2 years to kind of bridge that transition between the departure of the previous pastor and the arrival of the next one. A pastoral succession management process is frequently used when a pastor moves to another called position. There are 3 key documents that need to be developed in either approach: a transition plan, a search plan, and a startup plan. Let's look at the purposes of each of these. The purpose of a transition plan is to set the stage for the success of the next pastor. And that includes keeping the church strong during the transition period. The purpose of the search plan is to specify and call a pastor who will be a good fit for who the church is and where the church wants to go. The purpose of a startup plan is to help the next pastor begin on a positive trajectory. Why is a transition plan important? Oh, one of the things that we've discovered in our research is that during a transition, satisfaction, energy, attendance, and giving tend to erode. And that makes it difficult as a starting point for the next pastor coming on board. For example, if we look at the overall satisfaction in churches prior to transition, 59% clearly agree that they're satisfied with how things are going in the church. As a church enters transition, that number begins to drop to 53%. And after an interim has been on board for 6 months or more, that number typically drops to 45%. And now there's some polarization in the church, with 11% clearly disagreeing that they're satisfied. We believe that with a good transition plan in place, we can help modify some of these figures so that a church is sustained during that period, again, which sets the stage for the next pastor to come on board and be successful. Why does a church need a search plan? Well, typically in the past, churches have engaged in what are called mission studies of one kind or another. They take a long time to do, and we have found that they tend to envision a preferred future without giving an accurate picture of the current state. That makes it difficult for a new pastor coming on board to know what they're really walking into. It's also difficult for a pastor relationship to flourish over the long term if the pastor's not really a good fit for the congregation. And without that clear understanding of the current state, it can be difficult to know what a good fit looks like. Finally, the pool of qualified pastoral candidates is shrinking. The ability of a church to be clear about itself, where it is, where it wants to go, can be a real advantage to a church in a call process. Why is a startup plan important? Studies show that roughly a third of persons in new positions decide to stay on board or jump ship in the first 30 days of their start. So that beginning point for everyone, including new pastors, is really critical to how they see the trajectory of their relationship over the long term. Also, churches have different tolerance for change. Settled churches require a lengthy period of earning trust before a new pastor can successfully navigate change. In a settled church, a starting pastor will want to be cautious about making too many changes at the beginning. Adaptable churches expect change as an expression of leadership from a new pastor. They're going to want to see the church, the pastor, step into a position of leadership with some clarity about what he or she would like to accomplish. If a pastor comes on board and doesn't know whether he or she is dealing with a settled or adaptable church, they can make mistakes early on that will make it difficult for them to start on that positive trajectory. We use an evidence-based approach when putting together these three plans. What do we mean by that? An evidence-based approach is a process of discovery which integrates organizational intelligence, core values, and an inspired imagination to establish the course of action. This is a little bit different from impression-driven approaches, which tend to rely more on the internal thoughts and feelings of persons and leadership. Anecdotally driven approaches, which tend to rely more on conversations with individuals or groups that are not necessarily representative. And authority-driven approaches, which tend to rely more on the perspectives of those in positions of power. Having organizational intelligence enables us to develop site-specific plans. What do we mean by that? We're referring to a succession process which develops its documents, transition plan, search plan, and startup plan, that are customized for your particular congregation. This approach avoids a kind of one-size-fits-all and are made possible by the collection of organizational intelligence through sources such as the Vital Signs report that's generated from the church assessment tool. So now you know the difference between a pastoral succession plan, where the pastor remains during the search process, and a pastoral succession management approach, where the search process doesn't begin until after the pastor has left. You now know three key pastoral succession documents and why they're important: the transition plan, search plan, and startup plan. You know about an evidence-based process, how that's different from other processes that tend to rely more on impressions, anecdotes, or authority. And you know the meaning of site-specific, that what we're trying to do is use organizational intelligence to customize the approach to these 3 documents or plans that you will develop. In our next lesson, you will learn how to create a site-specific transition plan for your church.